Well, good afternoon. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to renew my acquaintance with so many friends, people who worked and walked together over the last decades to not just redevelop social work across Central and Eastern Europe together, but also to build bridges between our traditions. And therefore, the topic that this conference has chosen, taking up the conference topic from 20 years ago, really has a very deep significance for me, because it shows us that, first of all, the issue of defining what is social about social work has not gone away. It is still a deeply discussed and deeply problematic issue, but the context in which we are discussing this has changed dramatically, and the presentations that we had so far indicate some of those changes and how deeply they have affected us. So the conference, in a historical context, 100 years, social work education in the Czech Republic, the 20 years since our last conference, the 10 years since the founding of the faculty, gives me the opportunity to look at those kind of issues that have occupied us over the last couple of years in a wider historical perspective, still to try and go back to some of the more fundamental issues about social work in general. Social work education, I think, from the very beginning has been characterized by a fundamental tension which isn't unique to social work as an academic discipline, but has a particular actuality in social work. And that is that on the one hand, and it came into the university, it is striving to be based and to try to develop universal principles about human behavior, about social behavior, and indeed about how to intervene effectively in the knowledge about those kind of connections. So being a university-based discipline shares that kind of claim with other disciplines, with other professional groups, that if you practice medicine in one country, it should not be specific to that country, but you can transfer that knowledge across countries. It has universal claim to knowledge and to truth. But at the same time, in social work, more so than in most other disciplines, perhaps with the exception of law, we have to respect the particular cultural, social, political, and indeed legal context in which it is being practiced. And that challenges our claim to universalism quite fundamentally. And I will try to show that this tension between universalism and specificity in terms of ethnicity and particularly in terms of identity is something that is really breaking up today and is challenging the unity of our academic discourse and the unity of our professional identity overall. In what kind of context did social work first arise? It has definitely, despite its antecedents in welfare traditions of medieval times, it has its place in the time of fundamental disruption of social bonds. Social bond disruption caused by the Industrial Revolution, the movements of populations at the time of the Industrial Revolution, the creation of industrial centers all over Europe, particularly initially in Britain, caused a migration flow that is quite comparable to today's migration flows, even though most of that initially took place inside a country from the rural areas into those centers. But it also had an international dimension, as we know from the many names, for instance, Italian names, Polish names in Germany that go back to the middle of the 19th century in part. So that bond disruption necessitated a specific attention to be given of how do we actually form social bonds again. The geographical mobility, but also the anonymity in which people lived in those industrial centers made the social question a central concern of the emergent public and public domain. But we also have to see that the personal disruption was quite an issue. Personal disruption in terms of families, including children, being put into factories, had to work all day long. What kind of family life was there left? Now, the astonishing thing is, for me, that we find ourselves in a transformation process today that has all the features of that transformation in the 19th century. Our industrial, our production processes are fundamentally changing. Mobility is something that is being advocated as the solution to social problems, and at the same time regarded as a ground for social problems. And therefore the social question has to be raised again, and we do not know yet in what form we can move forward with our attempts to bring some sort of cohesion into societies that at all levels and in so many regards are faced with disruption, whether that's at the personal level, whether that is at the organizational level. For instance, the bonding functions that trade unions had in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, that they did not just have a solidarity creating function in relation to work, but they were also centers of social life, of leisure time, of bringing families to some sort of sense of identity and sense of appreciation of their particular culture. All this is no longer has the same kind of value and the same kind of function. What are the lessons of the first industrial revolution that we had experienced? Well, exactly that this combination of technological change, and again, just on the digital front, we are facing an enormous technological transformation, economic, political, and cultural changes that are all around us, causes the social fabric of society and the assumptions and principles about what constitutes social solidarity to become questionable. The lessons were, first of all, pure capitalism needs rules to contain the destructiveness of unfeathered, unrestricted capitalism. That had to be learned in many ways. We just heard from Brian about watchdogs being set up in Britain again to curb and to control the irresponsible growth of privatization in transport, public transport, in all sorts of industries, and indeed also in the social field. But what kind of controls do we need? New political power structures need legitimation through political democratic processes. What kind of legitimation do we have today, or the kind of uncertainties that our democracies are facing are bringing us into these kind of dilemmas. Social mobility needs structure, needs bonding, charities, and later explicit welfare policies were a necessity. They were not just something extra that you could have done without. Society would have not functioned anymore without the initial help of charities, but also with the realization of the needs for social policies. And finally, also an important aspect that can be learned from that history, the identity formation, what constitutes our personal but also our collective identities needs an educational project. Now, the nation states invented very quickly compulsory education. Schooling was no longer a private affair, but was something that helped to bond societies together again, for better or for worse. Very briefly, we have already mentioned Sping Andersen's 3 worlds of welfare. What developed in Europe overall, very schematically, were the 3 models of creating a welfare structure. The classical liberalism, still very noticeable in the UK, is based on the assumption that private individuals have the prime responsibility for their well-being. The state is an institution of last resort and should only be brought in to operate, as it were, on the margins of society. The principle that was being upheld by that is the principle of liberty. As against that, the social democratic approach to welfare that gives the state a primary role in the provision of welfare, or at least it has until recently had that orientation. Welfare as a right and not as something that is only granted in exceptional circumstances. The principle in that is the principle of equality. And finally, the Bismarckian conservatism that strikes a balance according to the principle of subsidiarity. We had the example of Germany still practicing that to an extent, where the prime provider is neither the state nor the individual, but institutions of civil society like the churches, like humanitarian organizations that then should receive central state support for their efforts. Here, I think the central principle is to preserve identities, communitarian identities, traditional cultural identities, and so on. Now, what that means is that these scenarios, which obviously existed in Europe in always somehow mixed forms, give us the basic challenge that we are confronting in social work, which is to keep those 3 principles: the principle of recognition of liberty and freedom, the principle of equality, and the principle of recognizing people's identities, to keep that together somehow. And I think that's what all social work and all social work education is trying to strive towards, but obviously needs the particular political structural context in order to fulfill that kind of a complex role. And if it is failing, I think that has a lot to do with the circumstances not recognizing the complexity of those steering processes. We know that after the Second World War and the terrible experiences of fascism, Nazism, we had a period of reconstruction in Western Europe in the form of a capitalist approach to what the Germans called the social market model of capitalism, but welfare was recognized in most countries as somehow moderating the effects of capitalism in terms of social problems that were caused by capitalism, but also had other sources. The emphasis was on individualizing assistance, and therefore our methods approaches, despite the reference also to group work and community work, was largely in social work on casework and helping people to make use of the benefits that are available to adjust their behavior to the requirements of society. And that spelled out a high demand for the development of social work as a profession in practically all Western European countries, often with training schemes that brought the social work educators to the United Kingdom or the United States for their qualifications. But we also had, and I think in this conference we have to remind ourselves, we had in competition with that Western model, the communist East emphasizing socialism with the alleged collective ownership of the means of production as the answer for a structural avoidance of social problems in the first place. Collective provisions of basic needs, housing, work, education, health, and so on, had a definite universal orientation and were not so much geared towards the individual situation of families living in different circumstances. And therefore we had, on the whole, at least officially, and we have a lot of experience in these circles, that the official picture and the actual picture did not necessarily coincide, but we had officially no demand and no recognition for personal social work and personal social services, even though, as I said, in some countries, social work education also was still present under those circumstances. Now, my hypothesis is that in both those systems, when we look back over those decades, we had a neglect of the dual characteristics of what constitutes the social. And what constitutes the social for me is the process of linking the recognition for the uniqueness of the individual to the provision of equal rights and adequate resources. And that particular characteristic was, as it were, split up into opposing directions and opposing principles, with capitalism singling out the needy ones as requiring social assistance. And even the term the social, and in social welfare, social work, was always associated with a sense of deficit rather than a sense of it being something that everybody needed. And that is a huge discrepancy that also later on gave rise to the association with social as being only something reserved for those with a socialist ideological orientation. And the consequence of that was that inequality was, as it were, built into the system for failing to recognize the complexity and the comprehensiveness of our concern for the social. And on the Eastern side, subsuming individuality under collective interests also failed to acknowledge human agency as a constitutive principle and constitutive element of what constitutes the social. And the result was a considerable degree of unfreedom. Now, there were attempts of bringing those two principles together, and again we have to remember in this year the events in this nation of 1968, where the attempt to have communism, socialism with a human face that brought the two principles together was so brutally crushed, and therefore the splitting of those two principles, also in terms of East-West confrontations, reinforced also of course at the political level, but with enormous social consequences that followed us through right until the events then some 20 years later. They'll be commemorating next year, and I was wondering in what way they would be commemorated, because whilst the wall, the Berlin Wall, has disappeared, what we can almost say is that the divisions in society have moved from the outside boundaries to the center of societies. The divisions, the social divisions, the segregation, the discrepancies in life opportunities and so on, still mark divisions that were probably as far-reaching as the divisions politically. Now, we had attempts of bridging the experiences, bringing the experiences together in the years after 89. If I can just remind us of the conference that we had 20 years ago, as our organization ECCE looks back on the attempts in the 1990s to develop a European dimension of social work education, and we defined that through a series of pan-European seminars that expressing a European concern for social work consisted in addressing the curriculum towards a European comparative approach to the different welfare traditions, to addressing the issue of exclusion, and to taking the social policy context and its impact on social work into consideration rather than withdrawing into the person-to-person dimension of social work. Therefore, the topic of the conference, European Dimensions in the Practical Training of the Social Professions. Now, the two people here, one of them has already been mentioned in the previous talk. Their influence on welfare politics with workfare as the creation of Ronald Reagan and the denial of any social responsibility by the collective, by society for people through Thatcher has been mentioned, but I do not think that they were actually the causes of those changes, but they were exponents of changes that had to do with the unresolved issues from before '89 and that remained unaddressed in this assumption that with '89 we experienced, as it were, the end of ideology, the end of confrontation, that the social was just something that would now happen automatically rather than something that had to be addressed collectively. So, did we have since those days a liberal conversion on this new consensus of liberalization, or do we have new divisions arising? Well, we had the liberalization of trade exchanges and indeed also of service exchanges, as we have seen. International service and care agencies are operating across national boundaries, and there have been attempts at liberalization of the exchange and the facilities for agencies to operate internationally. The expansion of the European Union, the Schengen Agreement, the free movement across most of the boundaries in Europe has been a tangible effect of the liberalization and of the emphasis on individual freedom. Transnational social networks, also facilitated by the technology on the internet and the ability to communicate with people with much greater ease and much fewer costs than it has been in the old days of telephone international costs and so on. A lifestyle free for all, as I would call it, that people put their identities together from a kind of a supermarket of global offers, and therefore culminating this end of ideology, intellectually framed, and that was also the subject of the talk this morning, of a kind of a postmodern relaxation or relativism, as we can call it, that had criticized the accumulation of power in big narratives, in big systems, ideological systems or scientific systems, to, as it were, equalize the legitimacy of one way of thinking about an issue or another way of thinking. These are just subjective approaches to that. Do we really converge on that, or do we see the backlash to that kind of inconsiderate and one-sided form of emphasizing freedom and liberation today? What we have is the re-emergence of so-called popular nationalism in so many contexts. We have the re-emergence of walls in conflict areas, if we just look at some of them that are particularly prominent in the public eyes or are perhaps even forgotten again. We have a wall running right through a city in Europe, in Belfast, still of that kind. And we have scenes like this, not just in a particularly notorious country in the vicinity here, but we have border restrictions and attempts of building either physical or ideological and policing control walls around so many different countries in Europe. Like when I travel the border between Italy and Austria, we do not need to show our passports anymore on the Brenner Pass. But there are 3 police forces entering the trains in Trient, one from Italy, one from Austria, and one from Germany, picking out every passenger who doesn't look typically Italian or German and asking them for their identity. I was never controlled myself, but all the people with a darker appearance get singled out like that. This is border re-emergence in the most discriminating and in the most foul way, as I would see it. We have this kind of picture of politics, right-wing populists in Europe. At the end of last year, I think it has even worsened this year. The darker the shades, the higher the proportion of those kind of parties in most countries of Europe. And if you look at coalition or governments formed by right-wing parties, this is the picture of Europe today. Europe is not just fortress Europe on the outside. Europe is becoming full of boundaries and divisions inside again. And we can experience this kind of polarization between the celebration of individual freedom on the one hand and a clampdown on individual freedom on the other side. Privatization also belongs to this side of introducing new certainties, new controls, new centers of power, not just in the industrial and in the general public sphere, but as we have seen also in the social sphere, the political insistence on facts, this is just the way it is one of the prevailing political arguments. The factuality, even though it might be based on fake news, instant reporting, television pictures that have no background analysis behind them, just present the picture as if this was the situation that's going on at the moment. All this is lulling us into new fake certainties that are a seeming response to the uncertainty that subjectivity, diversification, and everything on that side has caused so far. We have the re-emergence of control also of the seeming freedom of big data. Big data are not a democratic process that everybody can make use of them. They are organized and controlled and filtered by power interests. I just read these days in The Guardian talking about Great Britain that local authorities are experimenting now with computer programs that can identify potentially abusive parents. So they just go through not just police records, but they go through attendance records of children, what kind of psychiatric illnesses people had presented with. They filter those big data and they can then target families as potential abusers of children. They don't need social workers anymore. They just need people who know these computer programs, and then they institute the particular controls accordingly. In terms of our intellectual response to that, what worries me there is the antidote, as it were, to the postmodern relativism in terms of the re-emergence of positivism, seeming security in something like evidence-based practice, that there are scientific models that pretend to bring us again the clarity of risk reduction, of finding methods that with a certain high degree of certainty will prove to be effective. And I think this is very much the context in which social work finds itself embedded and is not just our own issue in the context of all of that. So my conclusion is that social work education is very directly affected by this polarization. We find, and I think that is happening in many countries, a blurring of boundaries between different social work and social profession strands and disciplines, but also other professional, neighboring professional and non-professional groupings and activities, amounting to a high degree of what we can legitimately call deprofessionalization, in terms of this kind of free-for-all, opening up the boundaries in that regard. A critique of the knowledge privileges that have been accumulating in the professional circles, quite rightly. Again, Brian has given us the history, how that has resulted from consumer or user movements, like the disability movement that stated as its principles, nothing about us without us, but that has led to a fundamental challenging of what is the legitimacy of my knowledge just because I have a university certificate. Why should that knowledge be privileged over knowledge that is based on experience, that is based on other sources of knowledge? We have a response to that, however, and again, I'm talking about this polarization in the form of what I would call the what works pragmatism. As long as a method is proven to be effective, why do I need to ask about where it came from, in what disciplinary context, in what kind of theoretical context it was developed, as long as it corresponds to fairly numeric quantitative criteria of evidence. We have then also, I think in many countries, when I talk to social workers, a retreat to regulations and procedures, risk reduction techniques as a way of reassuring ourselves again and not being able to sustain the uncertainties that arise from boundary openings, also in terms of interprofessional, interdisciplinary collaboration. And we have this movement of the personalization of services, which has its legitimacy, but in that wider political context of dismantling social solidarity, this personalization has a very different impact and prevents many social workers and social work educators from addressing the wider context and the necessity to see social work embedded in those political processes. So what is the shared task of us social work educators? I would say, first of all, the conclusion from that very stereotypical analysis is that we need to question the overemphasis on individual decision-making in life choices and responsibilities that we find all around us, and really uphold the social as something that is a positive value rather than an indicator of something deficitarian. We need to question the overemphasis on human agency that we find particularly expressed in the form of the value that is being attributed to activation programs. I had a PhD student who studied how many social work agencies prescribe of their workforce that they emphasize that people need to be activated, whether they are disabled people or whether they are people in unemployment. Activation, which used to be a very important principle of social work practice in, as it were, on our terms, has been hijacked, has been used for political purposes. To question the polarization between care and control, where we also see a huge division between caring being left to non-governmental agencies to private initiatives, whereas control remains very firmly and in very different forms in the hands of the public, even though the political questioning that can be attached to that is very confused and very obscure in many ways. And we have to abandon the notion of a static identity, identity as something that you're born with or something that attributes to you on account of your religion or your language or your country of origin. All those kind of attempts do not help us in social work education to adjust to a very complex and a very divided political context. So regarding the social as an evolving process, therefore, I think requires, and that should be our speciality, it's something that we can offer not just to our social work students, but that we can offer to administrators, that we can offer to politicians, that we can offer to schools, to organizations, and so on. The social requires a more equal distribution of resources. It's not just a matter of attitude. It needs to be materially endorsed that a particular level of social integration can only exist where there are structural resources available. A revision of the standard paradigm of science in social matters, this fascination with neurology, neurobiology, genetics that is infiltrating fields of human sciences in many ways, linguistics, cultural studies and so on, that needs to be challenged with the knowledge and with the paradigms that we have in social work. We need to have an explicit discussion on ethical principles, and again not leave that to particular interest groups, whether they be the churches or whether they are philosophers, but these kind of considerations are part and parcel of our discipline and our professional identity, values across all the social strata, and that requires a highly complex process of negotiation rather than insisting on principles. But that's what we should be good at and what we are good at in social work, communication and negotiation of that. And finally, the rights and compassions are dialective correctives of each other instead of being split in terms of the social question, either being left to those people with a soft heart and the rights people, as it were, just looking at principles. This is where we need to share our efforts. And I think this gives a very exciting and a very international agenda for social work education, and I'm pleased that we have brought together the right people here to discuss those kind of issues across boundaries, sharing our common experiences, but also learning from the differences that thankfully are still available and observable in the different traditions. That much I'd like to contribute, and I'm open for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lorenz, for such a thorough and interesting discussion of challenges faced by social work, especially for social work education, and the floor is yours.
Ďakujem, pán profesor, za veľmi zaujímavú analýzu a špeciálne za všetky podnety pre nás vzdelávateľov. A chcela by som vás poprosiť, ešte keby ste mohol pridať váš osobný názor, vaše hodnotenie súčasného stavu európskej dimenzie vzdelávania v sociálnej práci. Špeciálne, keď sa pozrieme na masívnu podporu, napríklad Erasmus Plus a podobne. Ako hodnotíte teda súčasný stav európskej dimenzie?
Pardon? There was no translation?
I answer directly, yes.
Okay, yes, I guess.
I think again, in terms of European exchanges, we can see a similar splitting, or I can see a similar splitting, that on the one hand it is being done in order to emphasize the universality of principles. And I'm particularly concerned that our students, for instance, who are participating in Erasmus exchanges, find it often very difficult to get a course in psychology even in another country recognized in their home university, because it doesn't fit their model of what should be the right way of doing psychology. So there are a lot of obstacles arising in the kind of development of a European dimension. What I found exciting, and I hope I have emphasized that in our experience after '89 and the shared building that we have done there, is that we have learned to emphasize both the differences and the commonalities as a way of correcting one impression and the other, so that this fundamental tension between a concern for universal principles and a recognition of the legitimacy of identity is actually, as it were, the fundamental resource of being a European project, because Europe is nothing if it's not a diversity, but European concerns should also lead us to develop strategies that bring out the commonalities. And what we have seen so sadly failing in the European unification process is that all the emphasis was given on automatic processes arising from economics, and the explicit attention to social policy initiatives that were on the cards in the 1980s and early 1990s under the presidency of Delors, for instance, were completely swept away. And the backlash that we are getting in terms of a re-emergence of nationalism is, for me, a direct result of that failure to address a European social policy approach as part of the unifying process in Europe.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Walter, for your inspiring presentation. It's difficult to understand this tendency or trend of deprofessionalization in Europe, because the European Union has been established on social values. It is a social contract. And as Jan Keller this morning in his speech said that the social dimension is included in documents of European Union. So my question is, if something has gone wrong in social work policy, so we look different changes outside of social work. But my question is if we should do something in different way in social work. So I think you mentioned some points which should be considered, but I think that perhaps something more should be done by us ourselves. So how do you see this? Have we done something wrong? And is the deprofessionalization a consequence of our mistakes?
Yes, I think we can have a seminar about that kind of an issue. What we have perhaps failed to do or have not done enough is to bring those two considerations, as it were, into a dialectic process in our approach to social work training overall. Like, for instance, social work theoretical concerns are often identified with our concern for social work methods. And I think social work methods, even in that triad of casework, group work, community work, do not justice to the actual social work process, which always has the attention to the individual situation in a wider political context as its speciality. And that requires us to have both the knowledge of psychological processes as a constant across different cultural traditions, and the attention to the legitimacy, but also to the danger of national, cultural, religious, and so on differences arising around that. I think social work is basically concerned with creating social citizenship as a way of belonging, not just in an emotional sense, but of belonging in a political sense. And here, the rich use of different approaches to citizenship that we have experimented with in Europe, with all the failures that were built into that as well, should give us a model of how to address, as it were, the translation of citizenship principles into our concrete practice, whether that's with individuals, with families, with groups, with neighborhoods, with collective groups of people in particular circumstances. It's about giving the social a contractual framework without forgetting the personal and psychological processes that need to accompany that. And I think that principle we find in group process, in community processes, as a constant challenge that cannot be addressed without a reference to a sound political understanding of what we are touching on, whether we are aware of it or not. And I think we have been intimidated by this, not just in Britain, that concern for efficiency, for showing results, and for proving our worth as a social profession. We need to find allies who, as it were, together with us, say, not without social work, but without people who, whether they are volunteers or whether they are professionals in other fields or whether they are social workers or social pedagogues, we form a coalition that is in their various ways concerned about what our society needs in terms of bonding arrangements and bonding processes. Jan Keller's title of his book, The Ties That Bond, is, I think, a good motto for that kind of a shared concern. And that's, I think, what we can learn from all European exchanges, that people in their various circumstances, in various traditions, in various academic discourses, ultimately are concerned about this shared task.
Explicit discussions on ethical principles and values across all social strata. Wow. More and more, I have the impression social classes are more and more closed and develop their own values and ethical principles and are not interested. Sometimes they are not interested in the society and in the upper classes, and in the down classes we are not interested to integrate them sometimes. Have we in an open society at all a chance to find values we all share? More and more, I have the impression we have more and more, or less and less values we all share in the living together in a society. And my sociological analysis would be, is it possible and is it necessary? by the way, social work has only to one or two social strata access. To the other, nobody is interested in social work there, and social worker has no access, even no access to the to the quarters in which they live. And therefore, is social work maybe overtaxed, or must it be a goal or object of social work to initiate such discussions? I think it's a very difficult question.
Thank you. Yes. In the concern for ethical principles and value systems, again, I recognize the same kind of a splitting has occurred in recent decades. That on the one hand, we have downplayed ethical concerns for fear of becoming dogmatic and for fear of not being open to the diversity of opinions, positions that can be taken on anything like, I don't know, abortion as being a typical issue. So the superficial liberal approach of letting everybody have their own position and their own attitudes, I think has played down, if not eliminated, the skills and competences of dealing with ethical issues in social work education and in social work practice. And that again, I think, has triggered a backlash of movements that say, we know what ethical principles are, and we, as it were, have very clear ideas, position, boundaries, and can, as it were, measure actions and interventions against our principles, whether that's from a religious point of view or from a political point of view. The value bastions that have emerged are a direct pendant to that kind of a seeming liberalization, as I would call it, that was the result of a neglected engagement with ethical issues. And so what I think is required in social work is not so much a catalogue of ethical principles that we all agree on, but the emphasis of the communicative competences of dealing with diversity of ethical positions without resorting to relativism, of saying, I stand for this position and regard this as a better and as a more correct way of treating children or treating women or dealing with particular issues of biology and genetics and so on. But I do not refer just to principles that somebody else has defined for me because I belong to that club or I belong into that particular strata of society. But I open myself to a debate about that kind of a controversy and see what that triggers in me and in the person who is engaging on their part with my dialogue. And I think social workers on the whole, and I think that's where the practice experience counts, cannot do their practice without constantly addressing those kind of dilemmas, controversies, nuances in interpretation, and develop their strategies privately because causes on the whole have not given recognition to developing those skills openly and directly.
Well, just maybe a short comment, because thank you for your presentation, summarizing your reflection you mentioned about the task of social worker educators, yes? And of course, reflecting on that I'm engaged in social work education for more than 23 years, I asked the question for myself, yes, as the academic teacher, what kind of responsibilities and what kind of choices do we have in the changing, European context and in these changing societies, when we are reflecting on social work as a profession and discipline based on very great values on equality, rights, and using the humanistic approach from the pedagogical concepts, especially social pedagogy, activation, and strengths based approach, services, and so on and so on. Always we are trying, to introduce our attitudes to our students, but now it's very difficult, to share the ideas, to create these proper attitudes of our professionals in times of polarization, yes, and in times of division of some ideas which were very alive 20 years ago even in our community of social work educators.
Yes, I know about those difficulties from my own experience and what kind of changes have happened in academia generally. I think we are coming also in academia under a lot of pressure to deliver to particular targets rather than use the freedom that I think academic life and academic research still gives us, and we are sometimes letting the practice down in terms of just delivering research projects that are in demand or that are being funded, rather than saying, no, we have our own agenda and we insist on using the space and the margins of freedom that we have for this kind of a critical reflection. I think on the whole, I'm fascinated by the use that we can make of our social work skills, both in terms of our approach to teaching, because in a way, without wanting to use our students as clients, but the processes that we utilize in good teaching are very closely related to good social work competences. And furthermore, I think that these kind of practice principles also should and do in many cases shape our approach to research. That in terms of what we do in research, we also bring together a technical competence with an ethical consideration, with an attention to rights, with an attention to interdisciplinary concepts that we bring together. So I think what I regret most amongst my colleagues is that feeling of inferiority. We are in the university, but we are always looking over our shoulder how the psychologists behave, how the sociologists have status, how the political scientists have status. We don't need that status. We have our skills. And if we use our skills, our colleagues in other disciplines often are grateful that we are part of the academic communities, because we do have something very special to offer to the dilemmas that are being addressed in psychology, that are being addressed even in agricultural theory, as I noticed in my university. There are opportunities of disseminating our skills rather than feeling inferior about them.
Yes, thank you, Walter, for another interesting speech. My name is Lars Ugerhøj from Aalborg University, Denmark. I've been thinking about this whole day, actually. The interesting thing is that we seem to know enough to do something. The problem is, how do we get through to practitioners? how do we get through to service users? Because we have, I think everybody has the problem of the division between practice and academia, but we could be the profession who could connect, but we don't seem to connect very well. The development in Denmark is that we have a growing group of academics, master students or masters of social work. We have PhD in social work, but there's still lacking the connection between the bachelor level, which is the frontline social workers. So do you have any ideas of how can we connect this? How can we connect the knowledge we have? Because, I mean, the social workers need this knowledge, these analysis, to do something together with us, even to do something together as frontline social workers. But we keep having this problem, and I mean, we should be the profession who could connect, who could join these efforts. But I'm still puzzling with this, although I've been fighting with this my whole career. So please give the answer.
Well, if you hadn't asked that question, but somebody else, I would have immediately turned to you and asked you, because in Europe, I think you and the kind of research you're doing in Denmark is a good example of the collaborative approach that you have to research, the wide dissemination of people coming to academic training in social work and then going out into practice. I think it is about that kind of dual process of emphasizing our speciality and our identity as an academic discipline, and not being content with what happens in most countries, that our PhD students have to do a PhD in sociology or in psychology or in political science and then somehow bend it towards social work, but to foster a social work identity at all levels of the academic triad of bachelor, master and PhD. What I found very important was that then, for instance, the PhD students have regular contacts with the bachelor students and not are being seen as a world of their own, so that the research that they are doing filters through often much more easily than the research that we at the professor level are doing to the bachelor students. And I also find that just having the occasional seminar, I mean, again, we are in a particular situation. Our region, at least in Bolzano, has very small numbers and very personal contacts. But if I have people give a seminar, like for instance Hans Thiersch from Germany, people flock to him and are absolutely inspired after a talk that is given, because there is a thirst for standing back and seeing their issues taken up by an academic who speaks their language and who engages with their concerns. And I think that's a responsibility on both sides that we need to develop further.